I'm going to take a moment to introduce them, and I think what's really awesome is that we brought together people who had very different perspectives on the intersections of philanthropy. So the theme of the whole conference was around LGBTQ philanthropy, but of course queer people they're so diverse. We're all religions, all colors, all genders, all abilities, and so LGBT philanthropy is quite unique and quite interesting. And so this panel was really formed to have a conversation about the intersections of diversity, and really awesome group of people. So I'll take a moment to introduce our panel, and maybe you can just put your hand up. Ken Aucoin. Ken Aucoin. Ken is the Vice President of Development for Inspire, Canada's largest Indigenous-led charity devoted to improving educational outcomes of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis students across Canada. As a senior-level certified fundraising executive with more than 20 years of success in the charitable sector, Ken joined the Inspire executive team in January 2011. He's a graduate of the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design in Halifax, and Ryerson University in Toronto. He previously worked with some of Canada's top arts organizations, post-secondary institutions including the National Ballet School, University of Toronto, and Ryerson. Ken is a member of the AFP and an active volunteer in the community. He also helped to co-found the LGBT Giving Network in 2006. Rupen Seoni. Rupen is the Vice President and Practice Leader at Environics Analytics. Rupen leads the government, healthcare, and nonprofit practice. He brings 20 years of experience in market analytics, working with market leaders to unlock the value of information in decision-making and strategy. His practice area specializes in helping public sector organizations understand population trends, segmentation, and performance benchmarking. As a consultant, Rupen has helped nonprofits such as Pride Toronto and First Night measure the economic impact and marketing opportunities of these festivals. Rupen is on the board of the Canadian Urban Institute. He's a former board member of Community One Foundation, which is an LGBT community foundation in Toronto, and he graduated from the University of Toronto with a master's degree in urban planning. Rupen. Carol Seidman. Carol is the director of the UJA Federation of Greater Toronto, the Greater Toronto Tomorrow campaign, with an ambitious goal of raising over $400 million for capital projects on 3 campuses. Carol served as the Assistant Dean of the University of Toronto Faculty of Social Work. She was Vice President and COO of Mount Sinai Hospital Foundation in Toronto, and in 2000 she became the first CEO of the Canadian Breast Cancer Foundation. She's a frequent guest lecturer and popular media personality across Canada, having been featured in many Canadian publications. Sharon Shelton. Sharon has been the Executive Director of Tropicana Community Services for 23 years. She has been instrumental in leading the organization through a period of growth over the years, and is proud to see Tropicana celebrating 34 years of service to the community. Sharon has completed her tenure on the Board of Governors of Centennial College and currently serves on the board of the Scarborough Walk of Fame. She graduated from the University of Waterloo with a Master's of Applied Science and Organizational Behavior. She has a passion for community services, particularly the development of young people, and she's pursuing new interest in alternative dispute resolution. And I also have our moderator, Nancy Horvath. So Nancy is Associate Director of Major Gifts at Sick Kids Foundation here in Toronto. She has been working in annual giving, community development, and major gifts, including St. Michael's Hospital Foundation, Tammy, and Stephen Thomas. Nancy has been involved with AFP since 2006, serving as past co-chair for Fundraising Day and currently chair of Inclusion and Equity Committee. She's also part of the steering committee for this initiative, the AFP Inclusive Giving Project. So I'm going to turn it over to Nancy. A reminder that there is a hashtag Inclusive Giving if you're tweeting for this project, and of course AFP Congress. So thank you. Over to you, Nancy.
Great. Okay, so Doug, thank you so much for an incredible introduction. As Doug mentioned, this panel was brought back by popular demand from the Inclusive Giving Project's LGBT Philanthropy Conference, which was a joint partnership between AFP and the LGBT Giving Network. So because, as Doug mentioned, the conference was focused around LGBT fundraisers, donors, and volunteers, I wanted to provide a bit of context for how we came to this session and what our panelists are going to be speaking about today. There will also be about 20 minutes open for general questions from you as the audience. So please, keep your burning questions, write those down, and there will be lots of time that we can answer those if we haven't already answered them in the questions that the group's going to go through. But just to provide a little bit of context. So when we think about philanthropy in the LGBT community, it really is rooted in a proud tradition of activism, social justice, and mutual support. From the 1970s to the 1990s, long before it was acceptable for governments and corporations to really be supporting LGBT communities and HIV/AIDS charities, individuals were the primary supporters, and they continue to be in a large part today. We see many of our LGBT organizations in culture, health, social services relying on individual donations for their fundraising efforts. So even though many of the legal barriers to equality have now been achieved, there are still vital community services that will require sophisticated fundraising support. While historically events have been common vehicles, which most not-for-profits in this community have raised money, we're now seeing that many other fundraising models that charities can use to garner support. And Canada has frequently been referred to as one of the leading LGBT-friendly countries of the world. There are a long list of rights and I'm not saying this correctly, but the movement has had a long history of developing really inclusive rights for LGBT people in Canada. And so how does that translate into fundraising within this community? We've been in 1995, same-sex couples were legally allowed to adopt children. In 2005, Canada became the 4th country to legalize same-sex marriage. We now have every province and territory accepting legally gender changes of transsexual people. But what does that look like for philanthropy? So this panel, who's brought together today from a variety of different communities and organizations, is really going to be exploring what some of the intersections, tensions, and possibilities come together when we look at philanthropy and inclusion. What is behind the meaning of the word diverse? Do diverse communities have anything in common, and what can we learn from each other? And how can we build partnerships across cultural communities? So that's really what we're here to talk about today. Without further ado, I'm going to get into our questions. And then, again, as I said, I'll open it up to the audience to ask some of your own questions. So this is a question for the entire panel. I'll give you about a minute or so for each of you to respond to this. This panel is about having a conversation across cultures about fundraising and philanthropy. What does this mean to you, and why is this important? Ken, why don't we kickstart with you, because you're sitting beside me.
Sure. Well, obviously, our success in the future depends on understanding diversity in fundraising and in philanthropy. I think definitely the donor base is going to change. We've seen the emergence of philanthropists and support coming from diverse communities. And it is something that we really need to understand and accept. And our society is changing and evolving, so therefore we should be changing with it. And learning that there are definitely opportunities that are out there with diverse communities. So,
great, Rupen.
I guess I'm kind of echoing what Ken said. I mean, I think it really means understanding the differences in motivation around philanthropy and fundraising. There are culturally driven tendencies or biases that different populations are going to have towards philanthropy. So, for example, some cultures might see funding good works as the purview of the government or religious institutions, or some might be suspicious of fundraisers because they come from a culture of rampant corruption and they don't trust where the money's actually going. So you have to work with all of these things. I also think that we need to understand all of these nuances to really effectively communicate to prospective donors, and that's important because of the numbers. And I'm the non-fundraiser on this panel, I guess. I'm the data geek. So I'll quote a couple of numbers that we did that I can quote from a presentation I gave a couple of years ago. At a conference using some analysis we did with U of T's prospects. We found that cultural diversity among their Western alumni, Western Canadian alumni, out of their over 45 donors, which make up 90% of their dollars, come from donors who are over 45 years old, 10% of their alumni were either Chinese or South Asian. If you look at the next cohort, the 35 to 44s, which are coming up very quickly, that number jumped to about 30%. So with numbers like that coming in a wave, and that's not going to happen to every single charity in the same way, but I think it's really important to understand what it means to all of you so that you're ahead of that curve and not scrambling to figure out what to do once it's already hit you.
Great. Carol?
What it means to me personally, I'm going to divide my comments into professional and personal. You heard in the introduction that I'm the director of a capital campaign, and what I was really proud about in the Jewish community was when we were building a community center. In the past, we always would build a women's change room, a men's change room, but in our newest campus in the city of Vaughan, we have 3 change rooms, and that third one is called a family change room. And it's there for many reasons. It's there for LGBT. It's there because if you're a severely disabled little girl and you have a male caretaker or vice versa, where do you go, the ladies or the men's? Well, now we have a family. And so professionally speaking, I think it's really important because we miss opportunities at every level. We miss opportunities if we are not thinking about diversity when we're building our places, but we're also missing opportunities in partnerships. And we're missing opportunities in every dollar we bring in can do more good. The more we raise, the more good we can do. And so to open our tent just makes more sense. So professionally, I'm very passionate about this topic. But personally, and it was interesting because in April when I was asked to sit on this panel, I was asked because I work in the Jewish community, and I am Jewish. But the person who reached out to me didn't know that I was also the mother of a gay son. And so I have a tremendous interest in this topic from a family point of view as well as a professional point of view. So it's really my pleasure to be back here, to be sitting here, and to be learning and hopefully sharing.
Thank you. After my next statement, you're going to wonder why I was even asked to be on this panel at all. What fundraising means to me, and I could only come up with one word, and that's grief. I dislike it intensely. I do have to do it. It's part of my job, or at least I have to guide others. But fundraising itself, it's not something that I like. Coming from an organization that historically serves mainly the Black and Caribbean community, we have had problems with fundraising within our community, fundraising outside of our community. Philanthropy itself, I think, and philanthropy defined as a love of humanity, is not, in a lot of ways, part of fundraising. Donors now need to know where their money is going. They're not doing it necessarily out of the goodness of their heart. You have to point out to them where their funds are going, how it's being spent, etc. And for Tropicana, we have not been able to articulate our unique selling proposition. And therein lies the problem for us. So, yes, I was asked to be on this committee, and for the second time around, I still don't like it any more than I liked it in April. But that being said, without the fundraising dollars, we would not have the freedom to do what we wanted within our organization. We would be stymied by the government rules and regulations. And so it is a necessary evil and one which I am desperately trying to embrace. So help.
Great. Thank you all for those insights. Carol, I'm going to direct this question towards you. You brought up very poignantly the diversity within diversity factor, that there is no one community that speaks to all diversity under the same umbrella. Why do you think it's so critically important to think about the diversity within diversity factor, and how has this played out in your own work?
In my own work, we talk about a market of one. When we're looking at donors, and today, how many of you were at Tony's session? One of his last points was how important it is to have a relationship with the donor. We all know that. We're in the relationship business. But he really talked about making the donor feel special. And so when I use a concept like market of one, I'm really looking at what is unique about that one donor and what is going to make that donor feel really special. And if you have a one-size-fits-all, it's not going to work. And it's the same thing in thinking about, for example, the Jewish community. If you have a member on your board who is Jewish and you think, okay, we've got the Jews covered, you're really wrong, because even with our board, which is completely Jewish, we have old and young, we have male and female, we have Jews who come from Ethiopia, Jews who come from Sephardic or Ashkenazi backgrounds, Jews who are children of Holocaust survivors, and Jews who were born with a silver spoon in their mouth. And some are religious and some are secular. So the idea of subgroups within minority groups is an exceptionally important concept. And it's exactly the same concept that if you weren't working in the diverse world, you need to be very particular about people you work with. I often share this example with the staff, and I say, you will lose a gift from this family if you call this woman by her husband's last name. Her particular value is to be called by her maiden name. And if you don't pay attention to that one detail, you will blow the gift. There are many, many of us in this room who can say statements like that about any number of people because you get to know what makes their heart sing and you get to know what really gets them angry. And if we're not sensitive to those differences, we are really going to mess up big time, and we also miss out on the opportunity. So talking about diversity within diversity is exceptionally important no matter what culture you're talking about, and it really begins with that market of one mentality.
Carolyn, just as a follow-up question, when we were chatting on the phone, you gave an example, and I think also at the last session, about a family when you were creating a new space, a family that had an LGBT family member, and how important that was as part of the work that you were doing and demonstrating to the community the acceptance level. Can you speak a little bit more about that particular example of that major gift?
What's really exciting about that example is that for years, for decades, the Jewish community has always run a leadership institute, and it was our way of saying we need to train the next generation to take on the committees and take on the positions on the board. We don't want our board just to be people who are in the upper ranges of their age and near retirement. And there was never a sense that we needed to have gays and straights. There was a growing understanding, thankfully, in this country and in our city and in our community of reaching out to the gay, lesbian community. And one individual who's a graduate of that leadership development program is doing unbelievable cutting-edge work in this community that is affecting the entire world. And I'll talk about what she's doing later on. I think it's at 11:40 if we're on track. But going back to a capital gift, this person is related to a family that have very deep pockets and they have capacity to make a capital gift. And how fortuitous that we could say to this family, we have a conference room that is in one of our downtown community centers that overlooks Bloor Street. It's never been named, but how wonderful if we could name it after your family and know that this is a safe space, not only in the morning time for Pilates classes or children from the daycare, but that it's called LGBT or it's called something so that people really feel that in downtown Toronto that they have a space. And so I don't want to go into any more detail to break any confidences, but it was an example of how when you embrace a community, no matter what the issue is, people start feeling like they want to give back and they realize that they can affect the world, improve and change lives the way their own life has been improved and changed.
Great, thank you. Rupen, I'm going to direct this next question to you. When we think about the diversity within diversity factor and about board development and volunteers that we're engaging in our organizations, how do we talk about being the person of color and a gay person at the table, whether it's at work or in a volunteer setting? How do we reconcile or contend with this issue of tokenism versus inclusive representation?
So it's a good question. I think I've been trotted out for my fair share of multicultural marketing conferences by the company I work for. But you know what? I think I think you have to have a little bit of a thick skin. I mean, I'm not a revolutionary. I'm an incrementalist and a bit of an opportunist. I guess I would admit to. So I don't think inclusive representation is going to happen overnight. And I think that sometimes you get your foot in the door courtesy of a little bit of tokenism, but then you have to move beyond that. So you have to show hard you have to work hard to show the value that you bring. So when I volunteered for a board that I sit on, I was the youngest by about 10 years. There was one other person of color who was brought on at the same time, and it was a very sort of orchestrated, calculated thing to try and move past the old boys club that this board was. And as far as I know, I was the only LGBT member. So, and I know there was one board member who really was not in favor of this sort of reaching out that they were doing. But 7 years later, I'm still there. I think my fellow board members, appreciate the perspectives that I bring to the table, and I'm chairing their finance and audit committee. So it does work after a while. But I think we have to also be a little thick-skinned about the tokenism piece, because it starts there. It's a starting point, and just see it as that.
Can you give us advice as charities as to how we avoid maybe making people feel like they're the tokenism, and that we really, that it's really about the skills that people bring to the table?
That's a good question. I think it really does come down to looking at the person, and just to Carol's points, I think it comes down to looking at people for the whole scope of skills that they're bringing to the table and perspectives that they're bringing to the table, and integrating all of that into what they might deliver for that organization, rather than just seeing them as the slot that got filled, as the LGBT or the person of color or a woman or whatever that category is that they may be thinking of.
Great, thank you. Sharon, I'm going to direct this question to you. I want to ask you about the issue of taboo topics. What are some of the assumptions and challenges you and Tropicana have had to withstand around taboo topics?
Taboo topics for Tropicana, we have a few of them. Our primary population is Black youth. And Black youth are plagued by racial stereotypes of being lazy and aggressive and criminals and having loose morals. But it's things that one is not supposed to talk about. It doesn't paint a very pretty picture. Those stereotypes are often epitomized and actually glorified by some of the urban pop culture. And it's very difficult raising funds for a group of people that are stereotyped that way. Another very taboo topic is just the word racism. We're not supposed to use that word because it's one that, apparently we just throw out as it comes along, as we need it. And I'm speaking of racism not just with regard to the individual's attitudes, but also to policies and practices and regulations, norms and sanctions, and how these affect us. We see a lot of times, we hear about young people being pulled aside because it's a black man in a Mercedes-Benz. And of course, it means that the car is stolen or has drugs. And it's a very real situation. So it is extremely difficult for us. With regard to the LGBT community, the issue of homophobia is a very taboo topic. In the Caribbean community, there are still laws in some of the Caribbean countries that, even though they're not really enforced, but homosexuality is in fact against the law. In some of the countries, the treatment of the LGBT community can be very violent. And we have heard several stories, we've witnessed some of this happening. There was an article that I read when preparing for the last panel, and the writer stated, being gay in the Caribbean is compared to being left-handed in the Middle Ages, which was believed to be an abomination and influenced by the devil. And this was a gay man speaking, and he said, to many of my peers, I am an abomination. This is an article that was written in 2012. It's not the 1980s or the 1990s. It was written in 2012 by somebody who actually felt that way. The key to surviving in the LGBT community in the Caribbean a lot of times comes down to silence. Unfortunately, the feelings have been transported from the Caribbean into Canada. And Canada is one of the most gay-friendly countries in the world. But we are made up of a nation of diverse people, of races, religions, and we bring that with us. So dealing with some of the issues that the LGBT community have in the Caribbean can be very difficult because people do not want to break that code of silence. With regard to donors, the other sort of taboo topic is that donors often think that what we are doing at Tropicana is preventable, or it's even caused by the young people themselves, by the clients that we served. And even within our own community, our donors would rather give their hard-earned dollars to causes such as illnesses or a situation where it could not be helped. So it is very difficult raising funds for an organization that looks at prevention rather than cure. And having to deal with all of these other taboo topics makes it that much harder.
Great. Ken, I'm going to address this next question to you.
Okay.
Tell us a little bit about the cross-sections of LGBT issues within the Indigenous community.
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm not Indigenous, for anyone who's wondering, even though I'm the head of fundraising for an Indigenous-led charity, the largest in the country. I haven't encountered a lot of LGBT, frankly, within the Indigenous community, that is, in terms of a donor or fundraising sense. There's a few, and certainly our organization has been well aware, and we have great leadership with Roberta Jameson, who's our CEO. Our organization, in fact, has been very accepting of LGBT, mostly as a result of the leadership of the organization. Our organization has even undertaken some diversity training and such. We've had a little bit of contact with some donors that cross into LGBT as well as Indigenous, and certainly the diversity within diversity factor, there's definitely multiple diversity within the Indigenous communities in Canada, with over 630 First Nations in the country, and half the population's under the age of 24. There's 1.4 million Indigenous Canadians. And it's growing, the fastest growing population in the country. So as our charity has grown, and certainly we've started to see the intersection of LGBT, there is a particular prospect that we were working with who's working out of the oil sands, who is Indigenous, who's a businessman, also actually performs in drag as a drag character. And there's a film about him called Karaoke Oil Sands. So there's an interesting places where we've connected with the LGBT community through my organization. Last year we recognized Kent Monkman as part of the Inspire Awards, or the National Aboriginal Achievement Awards. Kent Monkman is a very, very well-known, internationally renowned artist, very successful, who is doing a lot of work about gender and about the historical place of Indigenous people in Canada, and very interesting artist. So we started to see certainly more people coming out or being visible in the Indigenous community in terms of the LGBT issue. And that has been really interesting. I think that homosexuality in the Indigenous community historically, pre-contact, so that's pre-colonization, two-spirited people were revered. In fact, they were considered quite an important part of the community. But as a result of colonization, you've got situations where basically people are in the closet in a lot of Indigenous communities, and or they may be out off the reserve, and then when they go back to the reserve, they're back in the closet, kind of thing. So you know, I've observed some of this stuff in my work with Inspire, and there is an organization in the U.S. that is sort of trying to decolonize, if you will, on this issue. And they've created a toolkit for tribal organizations in the States to change their laws on reserves in support of LGBT people. It's a very interesting issue down there. It's starting to happen. So the struggle for certainly visibility and rights and all those kinds of things are certainly becoming very prevalent in the Indigenous community in terms of LGBT people.
One of the comments that came out of the LGBT Philanthropy Conference was that today we know that Aboriginal LGBT youth face more discrimination, and you just mentioned that, you know, historically two-spirited people were actually highly revered. How could philanthropy help address this issue? Or do you think philanthropy could help address this issue?
Oh, absolutely. I think philanthropy in this case could help. There's certainly more wealth in this country coming from Indigenous communities. The Indigenous community in Canada is expanding considerably. There's a burgeoning middle class of Indigenous people. I don't know if most people know, but most Indigenous people now do not live on reserves. They live in urban centers, and we continue to see the migration of Indigenous people from reserves into urban centers. And of course, a burgeoning middle class means potentially more donors. Provinces like Manitoba and Saskatchewan, for example, with the population growth of Indigenous people, will be in the majority in the future, and the not too distant future. So in 2030, 2040, we'll start to see in cities like Manitoba, for example, or in cities like Winnipeg, Manitoba, you're going to see the majority of the population become Indigenous. So this is definitely something that, as a result of that growing population, certainly, and the LGBTQ rights movement, these two things will certainly collide, and certainly you'll start to see LGBT donors that are two-spirited that will come to the fore, for sure. Particularly when you see some of the wealth that's being created around resource-based industries in this country. There's certainly a lot of wealth that's going to be created, and certainly they will become prospects. So I see there's an opportunity for us to be, for example, we do scholarships and bursaries for Indigenous students across Canada. I envision that we'll have scholarships eventually for two-spirited students in universities and colleges in the country, supported by two-spirited donors. So I think there's definitely an opportunity for donors to help continue the process of decolonization, if you will, with LGBT issues around the Indigenous community.
You could say maybe that the persecution of the LGBT community could also be related. We're hearing a lot in media right now about the persecution of women, young women in the Aboriginal community.
Absolutely.
Do you see that also could be a connector for philanthropists and an opportunity for the LGBT community to get behind a really important issue here in Canada?
Absolutely. Certainly the discrimination that exists in this country against Indigenous people is real. It's very prevalent. And I think that, certainly also issues around supportive Indigenous women in this country. Certainly there's a lot of correlation between those two, and donors could certainly help. Indigenous women in this country are actually the ones that are leading the way in terms of the comeback, as John Ralston Saul has called it in his new book about Indigenous Canadians. So certainly there's a lot of potential there for donors and the LGBT community to support individuals in this community.
Carol, I'm going to direct this next question to you. What kind of work has been done in the Jewish community to welcome and support members of the LGBT community?
I'm going to answer that. Did everyone hear the question? What is being done in the Jewish community to support and welcome members of the LGBT community? And I'm thinking about Sharon's words when she talked about silence and she talked about stigma. As much as I'm going to be telling you some positive things, there is still very much a stigma amongst certain people, so this hasn't been one easy road. That being said, 14 years ago here in Toronto, a small organization started called Kulanu, which is the Hebrew word for all of us. And just this year during World Pride this summer, Kulanu hosted 18 events in Toronto for communities all over the world. It's still a little shoestring organization, and I know it personally because the very first time my husband and I went to anything for parents or for anyone related to being in a family with an LGBT family member was sponsored by Kulanu. It was at the University of Toronto campus, and I remember getting out of our car and the slow walking into that space. And it's hard for me to believe that it was such a red letter day because I was just going to hear a lecture. I was just going to hear a rabbi who had come into Toronto from New York City who didn't want to give up his deep love of Judaism and his deep thirst for knowledge in studying the holy books. But he also didn't want to give up who he was as a gay man. And today he still is an Orthodox rabbi in New York. His name is Rabbi Stephen Greenberg. And he has been consulting with rabbis all over North America when parents and children come to their own rabbi and say, what do I do? My daughter is lesbian, or what do I do? My son is gay. And they always seem to call Rabbi Stephen Greenberg because he's lived it and he has been embraced by his community to continue to be the rabbi, which is very, very surprising in an Orthodox synagogue. You would expect that in Reform. Very recently, in October, a DC rabbi for one of the largest congregations in DC, a man who had been married over 20 years with teenage children, came out to his congregation and he was embraced. He still has his position. He has a very, I would say, decent relationship with his wife. They did divorce, but he has been embraced. I find this amazing in 2014 that these stories exist, but I'm also very aware I don't want to paint a completely perfect picture because it is a process and we still have a very long way to go. But our United Jewish Appeal Federation gives free space to Kulanu. They have encouraged it. They're very open now in terms of leadership development, encouraging people on committees and boards. And the actual people who support UJA, I am sure that there are some who fell off and said, if you do that, you can't get my money. But more and more it is becoming normative. And I take it as my personal political fight that whenever I can, I make personal political statements. And if you want to know some examples, I'm happy to give them to you. But I really like shaking things up and letting people know, A, there's no shame. I love my kids, my straight kid, my gay kid. And if people think that I have a handsome-looking son and they want to fix him up with their daughter, I let them know that that's not going to happen. and I also love telling this story. We named him Joshua, but he uses the name Troy. That's his middle name. Because when he went to Hebrew high school, there were 6 Joshuas in his class. So he just started using Troy. But today, his boyfriend's name is Josh. So there's 2 Joshes. And my son-in-law, who's straight, married to my daughter's name is Josh. So whenever I have an opportunity to tell a funny story, I'll say the only person at the table who's male that isn't Joshua is my husband, Peter. And they go, like, who are all the Joshuas? And I always make a point of saying, well, my son Troy's boyfriend is Josh, and then there's always like a boyfriend. And it's that opportunity that I have on a personal level and also working every day professionally to try to get people to see that this is normalized, that it is not shameful. And so we have a long way to go, but I'm really proud to see the little steps. And I'm just trying to do my part to keep pushing it forward.
Carol, do you think that within the Jewish community there are fears that for the rabbis or for others who work in the space, coming out may be a hindrance in terms of raising money from the community?
I don't think so. I think that the person who's going to say, look, I read the 5 books of Moses or I read the Bible and it's an abomination, I don't think there's a whole lot you're going to do. That person's not going to give you money. But I think that as more and more people, there are a lot of gay people out there, and the moment you start saying, I have a gay son, then you start finding out that other people have gay sons, and they have a daughter who's lesbian, or they have a brother. And I think that the more we normalize it, more people are going to say, of course these are a group or this is an organization that we need to fund. It's part of being Canadian. It's part of being in a community. You talked about silence, and I wrote the word down because when we spoke in April, I said I have stopped being friends with people who I know have a gay child or a lesbian child, and they still want to go for walks with me, and they still want to come to my home. And the kids all know, the generation that we gave birth to all know who's gay, and they're fine with it. So I know from my kids who's gay and who's lesbian, but their parents aren't talking about it, but they want to have meals at my house or they want to go for a walk with me. And I can't do that anymore. I have to have real friends who can have real conversations. And anybody who isn't there yet, I do what I can do, but I'm also not tolerant because as you get older, you have less and less personal time and you need to use it properly. So probably saying way too much, but there you go.
Can you have a follow-up?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I just hearing you talk about that, it's like I've always been out as a fundraiser in 20 years. I've not ever had a gift go down or get declined or anything as a result. And when you think about it, in fact, if there's a donor out there or a prospect that you're talking to and they don't have that shared value, I mean, our organization is embracing of LGBT people. Imagine trying to bend over backwards to get a donor in to your family, if you will, that is not sharing that value of inclusiveness and diversity. I mean, move on. There's donors out there, certainly LGBT ones, that have capacity, significant capacity. So find those donors that are really, that have shared value. That's what fundraising is about, right? Finding the cause and the donors and putting them together, and you have to have those shared values. So.
Great, thank you. Sharon, I'm going to direct this next question to you. When we think about organizations, and an organization like Tropicana, you have admitted your dislike for having to be involved in fundraising. It gives you a lot of grief. But when we think about organizations and the precarity of funding, especially when you're trying to stick with your core work and your core mission, how do you expand your pool and be able to deliver programs that are meeting the community's need when you have this challenge of getting those dollars to begin with?
Tropicana relies very heavily on funding from all levels of government. Of course, it comes with a lot of accountability attached to it. What we have managed to do is create a niche market around youth employment. And I am not going to be modest, and I'm going to let everybody know that we're really good at it. We've actually developed some of the more popular programs around youth employment, such as the Jobs for Youth program, which allows youth 15 to 18 to find their first job and gain transferable skills. We're lucky at the moment because youth employment seems to resonate with all political parties. They do consider it sexy at the time. Over the years, that hasn't always been the case. We have received funding cuts due to changes in government policies, and we've had to eliminate or downsize some of our programming. We used to receive about $200,000 from the federal government for immigrant settlement, but because immigration from the Caribbean is way down, we got cut, and we got cut in one shot. So that played a big part on the organization. It is, of course, a very precarious position to be in. We have to look very carefully to see who is coming into power and what their policies might be. And so, as I say, as much as I hate the aspect of fundraising, we need to strive to be self-sufficient so that we could keep the programs going that we know are very necessary. We have recently moved into new premises, and we've started programming in the new premises. And the space offers fabulous potential for many types of programs. And one of the things that we're looking at is to pursue social enterprise type of programs, so that it can help some of our other programs. We have been asked by the community to develop other programs, such as seniors programming. But we need to stick with what we know and to do what we know very well. The renovation of our space, for example, is incomplete. We have a fabulous gym space, beautiful bleachers with no gym floor, no basketball nets, etc., because this requires us to go out and do further fundraising. We have huge loans and mortgages and all of these kinds of things. But we are persevering, and the precarity of funding is what brings us back time and time again to the whole issue of fundraising and trying to find people, as was said earlier, with our core values, with, who really agree with the mission of the organization.
Sharon, what does the precarity of funding, how does that implicate your organization's capacity to be inclusive?
It doesn't actually. It's in fact the opposite. Being inclusive, it allows us to, we have expanded. We've expanded our mission. Our mission was to serve the Black and Caribbean community. We've expanded that mission, and there is a little phrase that we have put in, and all others in need. It in fact helps us to go to other funders, to other donors, and point out the fact of how inclusive we are becoming. A lot of the community doesn't see us in much the same light. They see us very much as a Black and Caribbean organization. But when you walk through the doors, when you look at our daycare centers, when you look at the people coming for counseling, the violence against women, people are finding us. And it's people from all walks of life, from all ethnicities. And it is actually going to help with fundraising. Inclusion is necessary. Apart from the fact that it's really very good.
Do your participants, users of your programming, is there any way for you to identify if people are from the LGBT community and how well you're servicing that community within the African Caribbean?
The youth members tend to self-identify, not the older members. It's as Carol said, the young people know when somebody else is gay or lesbian, and they really don't care. It's the older members that have a problem with the self-identifying, and that's where the whole idea of silence comes in. With regard to, they self-disclose within a counseling session, but not openly, whereas the young people would come out very openly and state that their alternate sexuality. So do we actually go and ask? No. It's something that we have been working on and something that we are very sensitive to, but we also have to be mindful of the entire culture and trying to bring the older members of the community into our way of thinking and into realizing that a lot of their children do want to come out to them, and they'll come out to us a lot quicker than they'll come out to their parents. But it's just a matter of having an open, safe environment, and that's how we deal with it.
Great. Ken, this is for you. Can you speak to the value of inclusion training and how that's helped you and your colleagues address issues, challenges, and opportunities within your own organization?
Yes. Our organization, Inspire, we're basically all about Indigenous education. We're trying to improve educational outcomes in Canada and for Indigenous students, and also celebrate Indigenous success. We've grown extraordinarily in the last 4 years. We've gone from 22 people to 36 people in about 2 years. Our budget has grown from 10 million to about 23 million this year. So we've been undergoing this extreme growth pattern in the last few years. And as a result, of course, we're bringing on a lot of new team members, and with a lot of new people coming to the organization, we really felt that it was important to do some diversity training. So we've done 3 sessions in the last few years, full-day sessions, in fact, with our staff. The last one was Aboriginal Cultural Competency from the Ontario Federation of Indian Friendship Centres. And you might think, why would an Indigenous organization do an Aboriginal competency session? Well, it was done because there's incredible diversity within the Indigenous community, for one. A lot of our team members are from the Six Nations of the Grand River Reserve, which is just west of the city. This is a reserve that's not really like other reserves. It's relatively wealthy by most standards of those organizations. So giving our staff an opportunity to understand what the lived experience of residential school survivors, for example, those kinds of things, really giving us that training to understand that cultural context, that history, and the effect of colonization, the effect of residential schools, all those kinds of things. Another one that we did was with Lorraine Kaminsky from Global LK. I would highly recommend. That was more of a general diversity training session. So, we looked at things like unconscious bias, insider, outsider, the way that humor works in the workplace sometimes to make people feel excluded. Certainly, these are some of the things and challenges we were experiencing when this session came upon us. So it really did help us to make the team members more cohesive as a team and more accepting of difference and diversity and all those kinds of things. So you have to understand some of these things in order to work successfully as a team together. And these training sessions we've done have been enormously valuable in terms of the growth of the organization, and also giving people tools to work with in terms of understanding difference, understanding inclusion, equity, all these kinds of terms. Defining that for people and helping them understand why it's important to the future of the organization, how it can be really helpful for us in terms of growing our tent, if you will, getting more donors on board, that kind of thing. Because, for the first time, this organization is starting to reach out to new sources of support. We had no individual giving 2 years ago. We're now building a strong base of individual donors across Canada who've not had an opportunity yet to support Indigenous education in a big way. So really giving people the tools to understand all these new constituencies too that we're reaching out to was really, really helpful. So anyway.
I think the same could be said about any community.
Absolutely.
Actually, Hamlin Grange, as a shout out to another session tomorrow, he's doing a session on cultural competency here at AFP. So it's something that we've talked a lot about as an association, about moving from diversity to inclusion. Part of that trajectory is really building our cultural competencies around all communities and how we work as fundraisers.
Yeah, I mean, in organizations, we've probably all dealt with, True Colors or Myers-Briggs or all these kind of things about self-awareness. Well, how often do we really get training in terms of our self-awareness about what our own biases are? How do we think about those things? How do we approach different diverse groups? All that kind of stuff. So, I've certainly had enough of the, Myers-Briggs type of stuff. I think we need to do more in terms of, our own awareness in terms of how we approach diversity, how we approach, how do we understand unconscious bias, and how some of our behaviors in the workplace can exclude people rather than include them, things like that. When I first started at this organization, the first 5 people I hired, the majority of my team were actually LGBT. Didn't plan it that way, it just kind of worked out that way. It's not that way now because the team has grown, but it became this kind of group within within the organization, and of course lots of humor and slang and things that are specific to our LGBT community was sort of going on. But it having gone through the diversity session, it really made us think about, well, okay, when we behave that way, it does feel like we're excluding others, or we're not including others in terms of building a cohesive team. So it really kind of made us aware of those kind of things. And I think more organizations should be doing diversity training. And you wouldn't think an Indigenous organization being, basically a social justice organization that works on education and all these things would actually have the wherewithal to do this kind of training. But it was incredibly valuable. And I'd highly recommend, trying to find opportunities for your own organizations for this kind of training.
Great. Rupen, based on your professional work with Environics, you certainly have insights on attitudes, interests, spending habits for a wide range of diverse communities. What are some of the things that you've seen when we get to this diversity within diversity factor? You know, what are some of the trends and nuances when you mix two or more communities' traits, being gay and South Asian, or being a lesbian and Chinese, or, you know, as we get into that, how can you comment on that?
Well, I can comment that we don't have a heck of a lot of data, that's for sure. On when you start getting to the intersections of smaller groups of communities, I mean, we barely have decent data on the larger communities themselves. So, you know, South Asians as a group, or Chinese populations as a group, or LGBT, or Black, or whatever group you're talking about. So, data is a challenge, and obviously all of these, you know, hyphenated multiple identities that many of us have different impacts on the way we view things like philanthropy, or even the media we use and the products we consume. I think what we have to do, and I don't actually believe that the good data is coming anytime soon, if ever. You know, we're too small a country. I've been through many iterations of, you know, big companies that have deep pockets trying to make it worth their while to figure out more about different groups of communities, and they struggle to make it work. So I suspect it's not going to work in a nonprofit context anytime soon. So what we can do, though, is go to multiple data sources, bring them together. I mean, we have to become data savvy, I think, to really understand what we can. I mean, you know, notwithstanding your comment about being one-to-one and understanding how you need to interact with individuals, and many fundraisers, of course, as you said, are relationship builders, and that's very important. In some of the clients we work with, there's often this struggle between becoming more data-driven and, hey, I just need to make the phone calls and talk to people, right? There's this big struggle between them, and I think the world is going to a place where there's an explosion of media channels and information and different identities out there that you have to kind of do a bit of both. So using some of these modeling, data mining techniques, I think, can be very beneficial to get around some of the challenges that we'd love to know what, you know, Chinese transgender populations would like to think, but I just don't think there's data on it. You know, I would say for a good example is your own organization. I think Sick Kids took a couple of years ago took a very strategic approach to understanding diverse populations and figuring out where they should be putting their resources. So you know, they did an analysis that they looked at growth trends within different communities, capacity to give gifts, propensity to give gifts to a health organization, and their penetration within those communities. So how successful have they been? To really take a look and put their resources behind the sort of the best bets that they can make, and then figure out how that's going to work out for them. I think you know, in Canada we have such a splintering of communities that you've got to understand what diversity means to your organization, and maybe that means that, you know, we aren't changing our strategy. But as long as you decide you're not changing your strategy after looking at the issue with your eyes open and doing a bit of work around that, rather than not changing your strategy because you haven't really taken a look.
Great, thank you. So I have one final question, but I'm going to open it up to you as the audience for about the next 20 minutes and let you ask some of your burning questions to these panelists. Take it away. Anybody have a question? So the question is, how have you engaged LGBT youth in your organizations?
Well, to date, we haven't, frankly, and Inspire. I'm sure we supported over 3,100 students last year with $10.1 million. I'm assuming some of them are two-spirited, and I'm sure some of the 20,000 plus students we've supported in the past are. But we haven't yet gotten to the point where we can really identify them in any real way. Prior to working at Inspire, I worked with the University of Toronto, and one of the things that University of Toronto did, I thought that was quite good, was they created an LGBT alumni network they often would engage the students on campus with that group. So students currently studying in the Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies, for example, which I used to raise money for, we used to often get those students out and put them in contact with current prospects or donors so that they understood that donors at U of T could actually support LGBT students specifically at the university. And those events, they have these events 2 or 3 times a year, I believe, and they've really, in the last 5 or 6 years, had an active LGBT alumni network, which is, I think, pretty rare in terms of most universities in this country. So that is one example that I can think of where youth were more actively engaged. There is also a group at U of T, I think there's a youth group that does dance parties or something that they raise money for. I forget what the name of it is, but that group. So there's all kinds of LGBT groups on the campus, for example, that they could actually tap into for fundraising purposes.
I've already spoken about Kulanu, which is at the University of Toronto, where they get free space from UJA Federation, and their very active involvement at World Pride. But year to year, during Pride, there's been a huge anti-Israel contingent, and kids who march and are encouraged to march for the pro-Israel faction have been organized through our organization at UJA. In addition to that, we've had a very successful program called Birthright, which is, some of you might be familiar with it, where 2 philanthropists, one Canadian and one American, believe that every Jewish child has the right to go to Israel and experience a trip there. And what was obvious was that there were some LGBT kids who were not comfortable being on the trip for 2 weeks without someone who was a roommate that they were comfortable with. Maybe there was a program once they got to Israel that would be, it's one of the most democratic countries in the world, and LGBT issues in Tel Aviv are very strong. And so there was a program built in for LGBT kids. If you wanted to go on a mixed trip, you did. But if you wanted to go on the solely LGBT trip, there was one that you could sign up for. And I think that that showed a very large level of not only sensitivity, but outreach. And through the alumni program of kids who go on these trips, there is future follow-up. But we have a very long way to go. I think we're all struggling with, how do you answer this question? There's just not enough. There's totally not enough going on.
I guess I can also speak for my former role on the Community One Foundation's board. That's a granting organization that evaluates applications for a whole range of projects within the community, and a large number of them are youth-focused. Seems to be a sweet spot for them. GSAs and other, they're arts and culture type projects. There's a whole range of things. So youth can apply for funding and for their projects, and what happens is the donors get connected because they have events where the donors actually get to meet some of the grantees, et cetera. So it's that's one way that LGBT youth are engaged as well. But it is, you have to know about it and apply for it. That's one of the challenges, and it's not a big organization. So.
Sorry, can I have a follow-up?
Sure.
Sorry, just to be clear, it was, and I appreciate your organizational work directed to assist LGBT youth. My question specifically was, how do I engage LGBT youth in my fundraising? So how do I include them, and hopefully you can provide some insight on maybe some tactics that you've used to engage them on the actual fundraising side, not necessarily on the programming and the support side.
So just a clarification on the question, not just the programs that have been developed around LGBT youth, but how have the panelists engaged LGBT youth in fundraising for their own organizations?
Well, when I was at U of T, mostly it was around stewardship of donors or introducing the work that we did at U of T to donors. So having them engage in the process of fundraising wasn't them actually soliciting, for example, but trotting them out as sort of examples of successful students that are in a program that are studying LGBT issues or sexuality issues that are then they're going to be the leaders of tomorrow that are going to go forth and essentially make for more diverse workplaces, all those kinds of things. So the students that I worked with at U of T, we often would pull them from the program where they were studying. You can get a degree, even a master's in sexual diversity studies at U of T. Having those students have direct contact with donors and prospects was actively engaging them in fundraising, because whenever you can put a student that they're supporting in front of these people, it really helps put a face to the cause, essentially. I mean, as your organization, what does your organization do? Oh, MTCC, yes, of course, we know that one well. I'm not sure. I don't really know MTCC very well. I'm sure Doug does. Doug might be a better person to answer this question. Yeah.
My answer to the question, I think it's very exciting for anyone in any charity, is to encourage the youth to be part of a leadership development program. Fundraising is taught as one of the modules in the program. So in addition to learning about public speaking, how to run a meeting, how to deal with difficult people, one of the sessions is on fundraising. And that's for everybody. But in that group will be, some of the kids who are from the LGBT community. And then it's normalized, and then that's the person who can then see a niche and hopefully, because of the leadership training, can run with it. Everything that's ever happened in this world that's good starts with a leader, and leaders need to lead. And when leaders lead, the world becomes a better place. And every single one of us has benefited from people who have become a little uncomfortable, but have done something fantastic. And your organization has that ability, but it has to start by us doing the training and giving your skills to that group.
Other questions?
Any other questions? Doug.
So when you think of LGBT philanthropy in the bigger scope of the last 20 years, it's really been driven by and led by white gay men, right? When white gay men were hit by AIDS, they were the ones that started the first queer charities, and that demographic is aging and is older. And you look at the community today, partly why we wanted to have a panel like this, is that the community is so much more diverse. Organizations on the program side coming to programming, it looks completely different. And I guess what I'm really interested in is that intergenerational piece. If I think about the groups in our network, most of the major donors to queer charities or HIV charities are older people, and they tend to be white, and then because of racism and sexism, they're often white men. And I'm really interested in that dialogue with the younger generations, and the role of even groups like Tropicana, right, that may be working with younger people of color who are coming out in some of that connection, right? So how can organizations work together better to support and educate some of the older generations about what's happening in the community today?
You've touched on a very difficult concept. With regard to the community, with regard to the younger people coming out, as I said, they're more likely to do it within the confines of the organization rather than within their communities in general, and definitely not within their families. How could they be engaged? I sort of go back to Carol's point. We are probably too busy, and maybe we do need to take some time out of being so busy in trying to get the young people to, how do I put this, with regard to the workshops that we do and all of those kinds of things, just to get them to have a better sense of self, to have a better sense of who they are, where they're coming from, regardless of their color, their sexuality, just to have them come out of our program with a higher sense of self-esteem. And I say we are probably too busy doing that to not look at all the different factions within the organization. And it is something that I know that we rely on other organizations within our community. Mainly we partner with Black Cap to come and assist us in that area. It's something that we are thinking about the way that you have put it. We're probably falling short on in that area. And it's something that's worth giving it a second thought, to widen our scope within our organization so that the young people who are coming out do feel more comfortable and do have better resources than what we could provide at this time. So it's food for thought. Thank you.
I think there's lots of, in the next decade or two, there's lots of opportunities for potential partnership and working together. I mean, with the differences between organizations. I mean, I just think there's a lot of opportunity. There will be more opportunity for potential gifts and donation that bring money from that older crowd to groups like yours, Sharon. Right? That may not have been connected, but you might be dealing with the younger generation. Yeah.
One of the points that came out of the LGBT Giving Conference was that, you know, if you're working in an organization that doesn't service the LGBT community, do your marketing materials, if you're not a direct LGBT charity, do your marketing materials reflect all of your users? Do you have LGBT families if you're a hospital and servicing the community, just as do you have people of the South Asian community or women or single parent families? Or, you know, do your marketing materials reflect the kind of diversity that you want to?
Well, and does your board reflect the community is even more important, because that's usually where it comes from. Policies around diversity, inclusion, equity, all those things. These are signals that your organizations send out externally to potential donors. You know, is your charity able to, you know, how big is your charity? How strong is it? You know, how can you give donors, if you will, confidence that you can actually carry out their wishes if they are to leave you a bequest, for example. That's been an issue certainly in the LGBT community. When we look around some of the LGBT organizations in Toronto, they're not necessarily thought of as being strong enough to handle those kinds of gifts, for example. So, yeah.
So the question is, can we speak to the intersections between some of our users who, in this case, is a hospital is the example, where they have services for mental illness and addiction that might be affecting people of the LGBT community or the Indigenous population, and how can we use stories of share those stories of success in stewardship materials to sort of demonstrate some of those intersections that we see within our organization?
Sure. Well, just on a practical level, I do have a family member who has mental health issues, and when the mental health charity knocked on my door and asked me about supporting it, I asked, what can my donation be directed towards those programs? And I was told no. So I did not give. So these are I know that we as fundraisers, we want as much of those undesignated funds as possible. But we all know that when donors can know that their donations are going to support the things they care most about, that's what will motivate them. So I didn't give, I chose not to give, and then, you know, probably over the course of several years, my giving would have increased had I seen, you know, I have the capacity to make larger gifts. You know, if I know that this organization does have programs specifically targeted LGBT, but when I tried to make my gift basically support that program, and in fact there's a lot of LGBT people that do experience issues with addiction and mental health simply by the nature of what this community has dealt with in the past. So, you know, there's an opportunity there, but I think we're often too rigid as organizations when we try and engage with those cross sections of diversity in terms of how are those constituents being served by your organization. Is there an opportunity for you to create some donors around that program to support that community? And my impression right from the get-go was no. There was like, you know, you needed all this money for, yeah, I don't know, the bricks and mortar or whatever it was, but I was more interested in the program side. So, but there wasn't a way for me to engage, and I even provided that feedback to the charity and got no response back. So, that is one example.
I like to give an example, which I think is a little more upbeat. And, and the upbeat story that I'm going to tell is
Such a
about two
downer.
business partners who decided that they were going to make a capital gift with us. And we have 315 different naming opportunities, and they were each going to give $500,000 and pick something for $1 million to put their name on something. And the process of getting this capital gift, and pretty well most capital gifts, is about 18 months. So in this 18-month period, we were doing a lot of conversations, most of the time with the two business partners. And every time I get back to the office, my colleagues would go, well, did they close today? And they were getting really tired of me going, no, we have another meeting, and we have another meeting. And with two business partners, there's his whole family that you have to meet with, and his whole family that you have to meet with, and his lawyer and his accountant. And 18 months was going down the road. Finally, I thought, this is the last meeting. I went to it, and there was only one there. The other one was at the hospital because his daughter was giving birth. So I thought, okay, this is just going to keep going on. Now I'll have to wait till the kid's like a little older. Anyway, he said, no, I've talked to my business partner, and I get to make the choice. And today's the day we're going to pick the project. And he said, this is the story I want to tell you. About 25 years ago, my wife and I were in a crisis because our son came out to us, and we didn't know what to do. So we went to one of your agency social service places for counseling, and we went to one session. And the social worker, who was male, said to us, do you want to lose your son? That's the only question I want to ask you. Because if you want to lose your son, turn your back on him and walk away. But if you want your son as part of your family, you need to embrace him about everything that he is. He said it was the best advice we ever got. Our son is part of our family. He is still with the same partner as he was 25 years ago. His nieces and his nephews and everybody just sees him as a great guy. And he said, I want to give my partners $500,000 and my own to name the counseling agency that helped us 25 years ago. So I looked at him and I said, was the name of your social worker Simon? And he hadn't thought about this in a very long time, but I thought, well, what counseling agencies did we have at the time, and who was male? Because I also have a social work degree, and there weren't a lot of guys in my class. And he said, yes. I said, he still works there. Let's have a party, let's celebrate this gift, and let's bring Simon and your son and his partner to the party. And that was the story that we told. He said, I don't want you to tell the story yet. I want to see the place built, I want to see our names up on it, but the day that we cut the ribbon, I want you to bring Simon there, and I want us to have a real celebration. And that's what we did, and we had permission to tell the story with pictures. And for me, it was exceptionally gratifying. In fact, I started crying right then and there, and he was not expecting me to be crying, and I said, I'm the mother of a gay son. This is such a good story. You know, not just as and also going back to the office and being able to tell my colleagues, I nailed it, we did it, it's closed. But there are going to be times when they're not going to want you to ever tell a story, and there are times that you can tell the story. And this is, to me, a very, very exciting story. And they deserve that gift. The agency deserved it. In Ken's story, and I was being facetious because I will not give to anything that is not supportive of my values. And I agree with that. But when someone is supportive of your values, at whatever level you can give, that's the time to really open up your wallet and to embrace them.
So we have about 5 minutes left, and I have one final question for all of you as panelists.
Can I just add to that with regard to strategies? Getting people to tell the stories is empowering them, is how do you empower them? Carol said that they may not want to tell the story at the time, but something like mental illness is one of those taboo topics. Believe it or not, so is developmental delay. I have a son who is 21, he'll be 22 just now, with severe developmental delay. And teachers in his class all through asked, why do we do certain things with him? And I didn't need anybody to empower me. As you could tell, you know, after working in an organization like I work for, I don't need to be empowered. But there were other parents who needed to be empowered. They didn't want to take their children out. My son would go to school. I remember once he went to school and he flabbergasted these people because he said he went to a beach and nobody wore clothes. They, of course, called me in to find out what was going on. We had gone to Barcelona that summer, and he was right. The people in Barcelona, they go to the beach at lunchtime and they take off their tops, they go in the water. But that's what stuck with him, and that's a story that he gave. They were shocked that I would take my child to Barcelona, my child who he can't read or write, he's 22. But why not? He came back with an experience. And it's to point out to these people the kind of experience that they can share with other people. Julian, my son, is one of, I found out a couple of days ago, I think it's 500 in the world now that have this particular developmental delay. That's phenomenal that we could even find some of these people. And the only way that we were able to find them was for us to go onto the internet and tell our stories, just the few of us that do it. So it's encouraging them and showing how they could help. You being able to help someone else is extremely empowering, no matter what you have been through. So it's finding that way of empowering them to actually come out and tell the stories.
Great, thank you. So last question. Fast forward 10 years from now, what do you think diversity will mean? What will philanthropy look like? And what will be the new hot spots that we should be talking about or thinking of now?
Diversity will be mainstream in 10 years. And I guess it'll all be intersections at that point. But there's always a new group that emerges. So I don't know. But I think it'll be a lot more mainstream, that for sure, that we'll see that.
I think we're seeing enormous growth in diverse philanthropic sort of initiatives. Certainly the one that Christian and Leah led in Toronto was groundbreaking for AFP, I think internationally, in fact. But we're also seeing in other places, we're starting to see organizations like AFP, Only Diverse, happening. The LGBT Giving Network is an example. In the US, Native Americans in Philanthropy. There's all kinds of groups like this out here, out in the world, springing up that are specifically about philanthropy in those diverse communities. And they're becoming organizations with membership base. They're getting people together. They're increasing the capacity of organizations to raise money. This is definitely something that's increasing. In terms of a hotspot, I think if you're ignoring planned giving with the LGBT community, to your peril. We're not doing enough individual giving, in fact. I think a lot of the fundraising that goes on that's targeted in the LGBT community is event-based. And this is a drum that I've been beating for 6 years now, which is one of the reasons we created the LGBT Giving Network, to try and get the gay and lesbian charities out there actually thinking more about individual giving, because individuals is where it's at. And as we know, the propensity for making planned gifts is the absence of children. I'm not saying that LGBT people don't have children. They're having more children, but they're still having a lot less children than non-LGBT. And we had a speaker here from San Francisco in the first conference we did a few years ago. He was from San Francisco. There's a research study they did in the San Francisco Bay Area, and they tried to calculate how much potential there is in planned giving in that community. He did the same calculation in Toronto, estimating about 500,000 people in Toronto who are LGBT or self-identify as LGBT, just 5% of them leaving an average bequest of about $50,000 would mean about $1.36 billion. So think about that for a moment. If you're not talking to your LGBT prospects or donors about their potential in that regard, we're not talking to donors enough about individual donors, individual giving, planned giving, all those things, major gifts. So that's definitely where we need to focus.
When asked the question, I made the same note as Rupen, that it will, diversity in Toronto will be the norm in 10 years. And I can picture it. I say I can picture it. I emigrated from a country that was once considered the most cosmopolitan country in the world. It's Trinidad and Tobago, believe it or not. The tourist development company of Trinidad and Tobago stated that Twin Islands state is a blend of many ethnic communities, religions, folklores, and traditions, originating from Africa, India, Europe, and the Far East. Diversity naturally follows within this collage of cultures. I grew up within it. I saw it. The concept of diversity will definitely be more than tolerance and more than acceptance. It will be true inclusion. And as I say, I can picture it.
Great. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our panel.